Okay, so you know who I am. I run the organisation Propaganda Studies, which is a loose affiliation of academics who I cannot organise for the life of me to do anything particularly productive. But we have that organisation. I'm also, as I mentioned before, on the board of directors for the International Centre, and also co-editor of Propaganda and Focus. My background is academic, essentially, looking at media, conflict, and propaganda in particular over the last 5 years. What I was going to do today, and we just move to the next slide. What I was going to do today is, I'm very, very conscious that I'm kind of like teaching grandma to suck eggs with an audience such as this, but I was asked by Matt to talk about propaganda. So what I'm going to do, start off, is just talk through some of the basic issues to do with propaganda and understanding propaganda and talking about propaganda in liberal democracies, much of which some of you might be familiar with, but for those of you who aren't, hopefully it will be useful. For those of you who are familiar with it, you'll at least see how I approach this and how I think about propaganda. And I primarily have arrived at this way of thinking about it in order to try to engage my sort of colleagues within mainstream academia more effectively onto the issue. So hopefully that'll give you a bit of insight about that. But then the most important thing is I want to talk a little bit about what is termed structural deep events. This is Peter Dale Scott's idea. And the idea of this is to really start to bring in a kind of conceptual framework in order to understand events such as 9/11, JFK assassination, and COVID-19, which I'll also be talking about. And really the aim there is to introduce this as a concept or way of thinking about these events, which helps us to communicate what's happening, also helps to guide us how to research and how to think about these issues. And part of the logic here is to sort of try and get away from, whenever we talk about the issues that we talk about, whether it's to friends or in whatever context, avoiding the conspiracy theorist label and so on. And I'll finish up with sort of talking, I guess, more generally about what I think this tells us about the kind of state that we're in today in terms of our democracies. Again, material that you'll be familiar with, but maybe sort of some of this kind of sort of more abstract academic style thinking is a good way of helping to organise and to talk about these issues, again, in a way which avoids people immediately dismissing what we are saying or arguing that it simply doesn't make any sense. So that's what I'm going to try and do, and I'm very conscious of time and not to sort of take up too much of your time if you want questions, and we have Matt, of course, with some very important information in his talk. So I'll try and keep it to, I guess, about half an hour or so. So that's what I'm going to do, and next slide, please. I've never had this before with somebody serving me to... Okay, propaganda. Okay, what I always say about propaganda is that, and it's just lost up there at the top, but of course, as we all probably know, but many of our friends and many of our liberal friends and a lot of mainstream academics, whenever they think of propaganda, they think of it's some kind of historical phenomenon. First World War, Second World War, you can see a couple of examples up there in the top left-hand corner. Or propaganda is something which... Could you get your finger up? Hand up. Sorry. Oh, sorry, okay. I thought you were already asking a question. Or propaganda is something which is associated with foreign powers, with Putin, or with extremists, or with crazy people such as InfoWars, I've forgotten his name. Alex Jones, how could I forget his name? So it's something which is not relevant to understanding liberal democracies and how they work and so on. And this is the kind of mindset which has prevailed throughout mainstream academia for a very long time. Move on to the next slide. Now, of course, if we go back into the 20th century, we will see, and we will establish very quickly, that propaganda is actually being seen and was widely talked about by people such as Edward Bernays as integral to liberal democracies, a key part or mechanism through which democracies could be made to function effectively and efficiently. And there's a quote there from Eddie Bernays talking about the intelligent manipulation of the mind and so on. And these discussions were widespread in the early part of the 20th century. But over time, if we move to the next slide, over time, this has been largely erased from our thinking. And there are some very concrete reasons why propaganda has been erased from mainstream conceptualizations and thinking about power and politics. As Eddie Bernays famously said, he said that, well, propaganda, we were talking about propaganda and how we need to use these mechanisms to manage democracies. This got a bad word, became a bad word because of the Germans and the way they'd been using propaganda in the First World War. And so what they did is they came up with the term public relations to replace the term propaganda, and therein was born public relations. Move on to the next slide. And this has spawned over time, since that sort of rebranding of propaganda, essentially rebranding it to sort of make people think that sort of there aren't such manipulative mechanisms or tactics being used to control people's thinking and behaviour. Ever since then, there's been, as Phil Taylor describes, or the now deceased war propaganda historian Phil Taylor, a euphemism industry has established itself. And you know, we have terms such as public relations, just mentioned psychological operations, the military use that term, strategic communication, perception management. There's a whole panoply of terms and language which is used by various actors, some in the commercial world, some in government, some in the military, and so on, in order to describe what would have historically been labelled as propaganda. And through this euphemism industry, or these euphemism labels which we have, you know, this has been a major part in which sort of the understanding of propaganda has been removed, certainly from mainstream academia, and also in mainstream politics and mainstream media as well. These are things which are sort of pushed out into the margins. And again, people see it as something which is occurring somewhere else, or something from distant history and so on. But it's there, and it's very, very real. We live in a society where there is a large degree of manipulation through communicative mechanisms of what would have traditionally been called propaganda. Next slide. Just some of the key kind of mechanisms and tactics which are used in terms of propaganda. I mean, there's this informational component of propaganda. And so the manipulation of information in order to modify people's beliefs and also their behaviour and conduct. And people often associate propaganda with lying. They think, well, is this all that propaganda is? It's telling people falsehoods and so on. And that's certainly a key part of propaganda. Dissemination of information which is factually inaccurate, and the disseminator knows that it's inaccurate, but you're trying to deceive people, manipulate people, etc. But more regularly, you know, the point is made in some of the critical literature that really the key thing here is deception. That you often have politicians will avoid outright lies, because lies, you can get caught out in a lie and so on, and the political costs can be very severe. So more often you have this kind of process, this pattern of distortion of information, omission of information, exaggeration of information, in order to produce ultimately very deceptive messaging, which leads people to think things are one way rather than another. Misdirection is also part of the kind of informational realm of propaganda, and it's about sort of getting people to focus on this issue over here, and with the intention of pulling attention away from an issue which the propagandist doesn't want you to think about and doesn't want you to engage with. So misdirection, omission, distortion are the major components, I think, through which deception, but then again, of course, there are outright lies which are told as part of propaganda campaigns. The last 2 points there, and this becomes quite relevant when we start talking about structural deep events, and this is the idea that propaganda isn't just operating within a purely informational realm through messaging, through words, sound, language, and so on. It also acts through action in the real world. Okay, so what you find when you look at propaganda campaigns is you can have these public relations campaigns which are set up and they're very, very deceptive, etc. But you often have essentially incentivization built into that, and also coercion. So an example of incentivization is, for example, political actors offering tax cuts at an election in order to incentivize people to vote for them. Coercion is a component of most propaganda campaigns, where you actually have, for example, you know, legal restraints being put in place in order to try and modify people's behavior and people's conduct. And this is what you find when you look across even liberal democracies. You see a very large amount of manipulated information, which is primarily deceptive, but you also see a large degree of incentivization of populations trying to, as it were, bribe people to behave or to act in particular ways. and also with coercion as well, forcing people to act and behave in particular ways. And these are often operate in a very integrated fashion in propaganda campaigns. And again, when you actually sort of start to understand propaganda as being more than simply telling outright lies, which arguably doesn't occur as often as these other elements, and when you start to see, well, actually, political communication is full of exaggerated information, omissions, misdirections, and the world and the liberal democracies we live in are full of policies built around incentivization of people and also coercion of people. You start to see quite how wide-ranging these tactics of manipulation actually are in democracies, and where you end up in kind of sort of conceptual terms in terms of understanding the state of our democracies is that when you add all these things up and you sort of identify how often they're occurring in the societies we live in, we end up being democracies at the end of the day. We have such high levels of manipulated information and then strategies of incentivization and coercion that really this notion that people's consent is being gained in a way in which they're fully informed and they freely choose to do what they want to do is really very, very limited in democracies. We don't have much democracy. Next slide, please. So this kind of territory is, I'll come to this point in a second, but I mean, this is a well-worn example, but it's one that I've done a lot of research and writing on sort of a while back. You know, obviously weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. A lot of the propaganda in relation to this issue operated within the information realm, of course. And famously, the British government's weapons of mass destruction dossier, launched in September of 2002. Tony Blair going to the House of Commons with this document saying that what I believe the assessed intelligence has established beyond doubt is that Saddam is continuing to produce chemical and biological weapons, generating these kind of headlines that we were 45 minutes from doom. As we know now from the amount of material which has come out through a combination of leaks, but also public inquiries, the Hutton inquiry, the Butler inquiry, the Chilcot inquiry, what we know now is that the intelligence didn't say anything approximating to that at all. That what the intelligence, the raw intelligence actually said was that Iraq might become a WMD threat at some point in the future, but it's not a threat at the moment. And they cherry-picked intelligence and exaggerated bits of intelligence, and they omitted other bits of intelligence in order to really sort of just cross over the line into deceptive communication where they actually said Iraq is a current WMD threat, and they knew that wasn't the case. They allowed that to go out. And obviously they engaged in that kind of deception campaign because they knew full well that they would not be able to persuade Parliament and the British public to support a war if there wasn't a clear case of a clear and present danger on the part of Iraq. And also legally as well, highly problematic pursuing a war unless you could make the case that there was a real threat that you're having to respond to. So they exaggerated the intelligence, they distorted it, not necessarily telling an outright lie, but certainly manipulating it in a way in which it became profoundly deceptive. And that one unraveled. We move on to the next slide, please. That one unraveled. Now, everything getting cut off at the top, isn't it? But batshit crazy conspiracy theory. Now, there was a time when people who spoke about propaganda within the mainstream would be accused of engaging in some kind of conspiracism, some kind of conspiracy theory about how power is exercised and so on. I think it's fair to say that at this point in time, there's much wider acceptance, wider in the sense of the numbers of people, but also people within academia and also within the political establishment and even within the mainstream media who are willing to accept the idea that, okay, there is propaganda going on. There is extensive use of this. That powerful actors, surprisingly enough, do indeed strategize and plan. They frequently have a clear sense of their interests, what they want to do, invade Iraq, for example, and they also have the resources and skills to engage in propaganda. So, that sort of particular understanding of propaganda in terms of, as I say, manipulation of information, incentivization and coercion and so on, that sort of is, I think, more accepted now with COVID-19, which I'll come on to in a little bit. With COVID-19, it's probably wrong to say that it's accepted, but there's certainly, I have never seen so many mainstream journalists and politicians who talk and use the term propaganda to describe, for example, what's been happening in relation to COVID-19. I think off the top of my head, the Laura Dodsworth book, State of Fear, which came out a couple of years ago, Times bestseller, etc., was all about propaganda during COVID-19, and I think that was an indicator of how this had really moved into mainstream acceptance and so on. So this idea, talking about propaganda, and we've got a lot of propaganda going on, I think we're out of sort of, the immediate batshit crazy conspiracy theory accusation when you talk about that. So that's kind of progress of a sort and so on. But I definitely feel that the sort of needle has moved somewhat in respect to that. Go to the next slide, please. However, so that's that's been talking about, generally more accepted today, especially after COVID-19. What's less accepted is the notion that events themselves, real world events happening, etc., how those might be instigated or exploited or exaggerated, exacerbated by political actors. The idea that events such as 9/11, JFK assassination, COVID-19, actually, in a very important sense, become propaganda events in their own right. It's propaganda of the deed, it's action in the real world in order to shape people's perceptions and behaviour, etc. And I'll talk about JFK, 9/11, COVID-19 in the second half of this presentation. But this area is still well and truly gets you into, certainly with a lot of people, if you go to the next slide, back to Alex Jones, people saying this is just crazy, can you really be suggesting and so on that COVID-19 is in any shape or form a propaganda event, or the assassination of JFK or 9/11, for example. This is still sort of hot water, I think, and it's certainly hot water in terms of, or difficult territory in terms of mainstream academia and getting them to engage with these issues. Move to the next slide, please. Now, this is where I think the concept of, as I say, lost at the top there, but one way beyond the conspiracy theory caricature, the notion of the structural deep event, and this is Peter Dale Scott. And I have sort of increasingly been talking about this in the last year, primarily because I think it's a very, very useful device, which I'll explain more fully, for starting to order our thinking about what we experience and see with events and how they're used by elites, etc. So it's a very useful conceptual framework. I also think that potentially, and this is at the core of some of my work with IC 911 and also other organisations, is to try to sort of introduce this term that Peter Dale Scott coined and sort of try to sort of push it more into mainstream academic thinking, so it can actually start to effectively work as a research paradigm. Sorry.
Could you explain what's an elite? Could you explain the word elite?
Well, where I'm using the term elite is powerful actors who have a predominance of resources and so on in society. Not that they are elite in a pejorative sense, but actors who hold considerable sway on political and economic power.
An example?
Sorry?
An example?
Well, elite groups, for example, surrounding, say, COVID-19, the World Economic Forum and the array of think tanks and so on. Those are all sort of would be elite blocs. The neoconservatives would be a definable elite bloc and so on within the US political system. Is that? Okay, good. So, back to structural deep events. So, just to run through how Peter Dale Scott talks about this issue, and when he's talking about structural deep events, he's talking about the possibility that across major events in society, you have elite groups who are involved either in instigating a real world event, or exacerbating that, or exploiting an event. So the latter one is they're not necessarily creating that event themselves, but they're certainly exploiting an event for their own political purposes, etc. So, structural deep events, I'm trying to think how best just go through. So it's focusing upon the importance of events, again, this idea that real world events, propaganda to deed can be very, very important in terms of understanding propaganda. The second point, and this is where the kind of the notion of deep comes in, is that he argues that what you have is you have networks of legitimate actors, governments, public-facing institutions in democracies, etc., who are then overlapping with elements of what some people describe as the deep state, or the permanent state, or the national security state. And often you have criminal elements involved in that as well, and we'll see an example of that when we talk about JFK. And then what you have is you have sort of emerging between deep state actors with the public-facing elements of the democracy, which do in certain instances work to instigate or to exploit events. So what he's getting us to do there, and what he's trying to encourage his fellow academics to do, is to think beyond the sort of most visible institutions in a democracy. And this, of course, is where most mainstream academics remain. They remain with this notion that you just need to look at Congress, you just need to look at the White House, in order to understand politics and so on. But, of course, Peter Dale Scott is trying to get us to think, well, there's much more going on, deeper, lower-level structures where a lot of power resides. Military-industrial complexes, another way of describing the deep state, certainly in the US context. So you have these networks of legitimate actors. They might exploit or instigate events. And then where the term structural comes from is this idea that these deep events, which are exploited or instigated by groups, are events which are used in the context of trying to create a major and lasting change to society. So these are big events which change the structures of the world that we live in and the societies that we live in. And so this is essentially, in the simplest way, what he's getting at with the notion of the structural deep event. Now we go to the next slide. JFK assassination. Peter Dale Scott has spoken about the JFK assassination in several of his works. How is this a structural deep event? Well, it's a structural event in the sense that with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, you had a clear sort of drive to maintain, escalate the war in Vietnam and to keep the Cold War going. And this is one of the issues which has emerged over time from the body of research which has gone into the JFK assassination, is the identification that he was, as US President, clearly moving to try to end the Cold War, try to engage in sort of relatively radical redistribution of wealth within the United States, and also to try and dial back, scale down US involvement in Vietnam. With his assassination, with him out of the way, the Cold War could be sort of doubled down on. The Vietnam War, as we all know, was escalated following his assassination. And so this is a structure, this is a major event, this is a major point in our history, in the history of the West and globally for the world. This was a point at which the Cold War could have potentially come to an end with a rapprochement between Kennedy and Khrushchev, but it was terminated with the assassination of Kennedy. Who are the interests and who are the actors who form that kind of combination between the public-facing and also the deep state elements in society? Well, obviously, some people argue that the CIA can be implicated in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Robert Kennedy, of course, Jr. has been very clear about that in the last 3 or 4 months publicly, that his family, he believes and his family believes that the CIA were involved in the assassination of JFK. Military-industrial complex is often invoked by people trying to understand, the drive to keep the war machine going on, to keep the Cold War going on, that was coming out of the military-industrial complex, which, of course, the US President Eisenhower had warned about in his departing speech before JFK came in. There's also, for any of you reading the sort of literature on JFK assassination, the mafia turn up in various shapes or forms in terms of some of the issues related to Lee Harvey Oswald and so on. But you have a situation where you have military-industrial complex, mafia, CIA as this combination of actors who may well have been involved in JFK's assassination. And okay, you're left with the final question, is it an event which was exploited? Did JFK's assassination by a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, was that suddenly seized upon in order to maintain the Cold War? Well, there's a lot of evidence, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this, a lot of evidence that this was deliberate, instigated event from the deep state. He was assassinated because he was threatened to pull America away from the Cold War and from intervention in Vietnam, or war in Vietnam. So, again, I mean, I'm sort of, hovering on this, but certainly Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is very clear that this was an instigated, deep structural event and so on. But thinking about where we are now, and I'll talk about 9/11 in a second, this is, a major part of 20th century history with profound implications for the course of America and of the West, and arguably profound implications for where we are today at this point in time, especially with the current situation in the Ukraine and Russia that we now find ourselves in as liberal democracies. Next slide. On to 9/11. How can we think about 9/11 as a structural deep event? Again, maybe I'm teaching grandma to suck eggs here, but 9/11, obviously, as you saw in the Graham McQueen film, structural in the sense that this transformed and redirected international politics in a very significant way. We had the end of the Cold War, we had this kind of period during the 1990s of Francis Fukuyama, end of history, everyone's going to be liberal democracies, we're moving into this era of peace, etc. But with 2001, we were then dominated by the global war on terror. This was the major kind of reorientation of Western foreign policy off the back of 9/11. So, major change. You also have, I'll come to regime change wars in the second slide, but you also have the emergence of, or the entrenchment of the notion of the security state with 9/11, with the Patriot Act, with the kind of progressive doubling or pushing down on civil liberties and so on that we saw following 9/11. So it wasn't just about sort of a global war on terror, it was also about starting to change our democracies internally. So it's certainly a structural deep event. Or a structural event in that sense. Who are the actors who can be identified? Again, I think this comes across very clearly in the film Peace, War, and 9/11, Graham McQueen's work. Clearly, I mean, the first port of call in terms of understanding 9/11 for a lot of people is to look at the neocons and to look at the PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, the planning documents in the 1990s, the talk of the need for a new Pearl Harbor in order to mobilize a sufficient constituency within the American public to support major wars in the international system. You, of course, also have the military-industrial complex as another sort of clearly identified actor in relation to 9/11, sort of the utility of pursuing more aggressive, and even more aggressive belligerent US foreign policy under the cover of a global war on terror, and the kind of, sort of influx of money into the military-industrial complex that you saw at the point of 9/11 and with the wars which followed. Was it an instigated or exploited event? Was it an event where the neocons got lucky and so on, or was it instigated? If you just move to the next slide. And I will just talk a little bit about just how I arrived at this, because I'm a terribly, and am I embarrassed to say this or not? I'm not sure, but I'm a very late arrival to the fundamental questioning of 9/11. Because there was a sense in which, and I'll sort of get to how I got to where I am today on the issue, but for a long time, the global war on terror, it was becoming increasingly clear that it was definitely a structural deep event, or it's a structural event, but it's also very clearly one which is being exploited by elite groups. There's no doubt about that. And this, Wesley Clark was, I think, sort of one of the early people to call out, as you saw in that clip in Peace, War, and 9/11, to call out or to claim that he had information and knowledge that actually they were planning regime change wars around 9/11, without not wasting any time whatsoever. And when it came to the Chilcot inquiry in 2016, I think that came out, and that was the investigation into British involvement or British support for the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. What came out in the Chilcot inquiry was, as well as the confirmation that they'd been fast and loose about the truth of Iraqi WMD, that they were also, as a sort of a series of documents, I think section 3.1 of the Chilcot inquiry, which wasn't paid any attention to by the mainstream media, But you actually see these conversations going on between Tony Blair and George Bush. And this is actually an excerpt of a document between Bush and Blair talking about Syria and Iran. And they say, if toppling Saddam is a prime objective, far easier to do it with Syria and Iran in favour or acquiescing rather than hitting all three at once. And so what you have here is a conversation obviously going on between Bush and Blair about, when to attack the various countries and so on, with Blair suggesting let's hold off for a bit and do Saddam first. Essentially confirming or corroborating what Wesley Clark had said in 2006, and which had been dismissed by a lot of mainstream academics as conspiracy theory or overclaim on the part of Wesley Clark. This is pretty much confirmed. And this is another interesting nugget from the Chilcot Inquiry, was the regime change hawks in Washington are arguing that a coalition put together for one purpose, i.e. fighting Al-Qaeda, can be used in order to clear up other problems in the region, and so on. So what you had there with the Chilcot Inquiry was really final confirmation that in fact, okay, it's a structural event, and global war on terror, but it's been instigated, so it's been exploited by elites. No question about that whatsoever. And I always like showing, this is a slide, this is what Tony Blair was saying at the time. Whilst Tony Blair was having these conversations with George Bush about when to hit various countries, he was sort of telling the world that I will cure the world. You probably can't see the small print there, but from Afghanistan to Rwanda, Israel to Northern Ireland, etc., the starving, the wretched, the dispossessed, the ignorant, we can sort it all out. So this is what he was saying in public, whilst he was planning a series of regime change wars with George Bush. So quite a high degree of deception. But this for me pretty much confirmed it as an academic who's working in the field of media conflict and done a lot of work on the Iraq invasion, etc. That, okay, this has been exploited by elites and so on. But obviously, as we know now, and where I am now in terms of recognizing the volume of research which has been done into, for example, the building collapses, a lot of what you saw in the documentary, some of Graham McQueen's work, etc. We're now at a point where I think there is so much evidence now available, and it's very, very solid and well researched, which shows that this was an instigated event, and it's an instigated deep structural event. As with Kennedy's assassination, this is people within our own power structures who've been involved in actually going through the process of thinking, okay, we need to do something. With Kennedy, we need to get him out of the way. With 9/11, we need to start an aggressive regime change war projection of Western power in the international system before the next superpowers come along, China, etc. And this is the language that the neocons were using in the 1990s. That this was an event, 9/11 was an event which was essentially, as Graham McQueen describes, a false flag. It was a self-inflicted wound in order to create sufficient fear and to mobilize, support a constituency for, again, not just a single war or a small war, but a major series of conflicts in the international system. Again, with this objective of trying to shore up the position of the West as global hegemon prior to the arrival of China and other powers on the bloc, and so on. Okay, next slide. So, structural deep event, and with, back there, probably instigated. I think probably all of us agree here that it was deliberately instigated. I would add actually Kevin Ryan, who's also on International Centre for 9/11 Justice, and some of you will be familiar with his work as somebody who's a whistleblower in the company who was testing the steel regarding the building, the WTC 1 and 2 collapse. And I think his company established that the steel did just fine, but that's not what they said publicly, and then he blew the whistle on it and then was fired. But he has a very good book which is now available for free, and we're putting out chapters of it on the IC 911 website called Another 19, and it essentially is going through the kind of evaluation of the most likely actors within the US system who would have been involved in the planning and instigation of 9/11. So I recommend that as it were, shoring up one's sort of body of knowledge in terms of evidence that this was instigated by actors within the US. Next slide. Brings us to COVID-19. So we kind of been racing through history and taking this concept of structural deep event, running through JFK, 9/11 global war on terror. We come to COVID-19, possibly a slightly more controversial area for some people within the 9/11 research community, truth community. However, COVID-19 as a propaganda event, as something which is exploited, I'd argue that there's quite a lot of evidence now that we have in place from quite a wide variety of researchers and writers and commentators. This can be understood as a structural deep event. There's certainly enough evidence, I think, to rule out the idea that this was, a public health emergency and there was an ill thought through response to it by some scientists and some politicians, where there's very little evidence that that is simply what happened. But what do we start to see with COVID-19? In a way, I talk with a lot less certainty about this than I do about 9/11 and JFK, because in a way we haven't had the time for this kind of build-up of research knowledge that we've had with JFK, that we've had with 9/11, to be absolutely sure. But what it's starting to look like is that you have clearly biosecurity regimes being pushed, pandemic preparedness agenda, which is being pushed forward, pushed through the World Health Organization, which will enable potentially governments and via the World Health Organization to lock down populations whenever they define a pandemic as occurring. All of the kind of mechanisms of lockdown, talk about vaccinations, digital ID, and so on and so forth. And with that, a further concentration of power. And this is a theme which regularly comes up with people who look at COVID-19 critically, is that what we seem to have here is that if we had, with the point of 9/11, this kind of sort of, primarily about global war on terror, but also this kind of infringement on sort of basics of civil liberties, etc. at home. With COVID-19, that's really accelerated. We not only have the pandemic preparedness agenda and this notion of locking down entire populations, etc., we also have the notion of the censorship industrial complex, and we see this now manifesting itself in legislation, Digital Services Act in the European Union, online harm bill here in the UK, which is, these are effectively censorship regimes. So we can see this kind of the structures of our democracies being further eroded at the point of COVID-19 with the policies which were implemented, purportedly in order to deal with a public health crisis, which start to look much more like really a drive towards clear authoritarianism within liberal democracies. Not that we necessarily ever had great functioning democracies in the past and so on, but obviously we're on a slide down into an authoritarian abyss, as some people have described. We have a variety of actors which a lot of people have identified. Big Pharma, and actually Robert Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci, is in many ways all about Big Pharma and the way in which Big Pharma and US regulatory authorities have been captured by Big Pharma, etc. Huge financial interests built around the injections and so on, for example. You also have people who've argued that we not only have that kind of component going on, we also have the kind of global governance elite, the World Economic Forum, and so on, and the notion of digitized society, and connected to that, debates over central bank digital currencies, digital ID, and so on. All of these, and then these things have been moving so fast for 2 years, we forget these things. But as COVID kicked off, remember, as COVID kicked off very, very quickly, you had the Great Reset being promoted. And you had Klaus Schwab's book coming out, etc. But this all starts to look like a political bloc or a combination of elite actors, again, probably working with elements of deep state and so on, pushing and using COVID-19 as a way of restructuring our society, restructuring our economies, something which we're still going through at the moment. And again, so maybe the final point is, was it instigated or exploited? I'm guessing that all of you have various positions on that and so on, and might have made up your minds. Mm-hmm. I mean, at the moment, I'm not going to offer a position on this. I am aware that there are some people who are saying that the evidence is fairly clear that this has primarily been instigated and so on, whether that's through the deliberate leaking of a virus or through a constructed pandemic using the dodgy PCR tests and so on. but that it is something which was effectively planned and not simply a virus which came along which could be used and exploited by elites in order to increase levels of authoritarianism and to restructure our democracies even more. Again, kind of for me, there's a kind of a level of uncertainty there which there isn't for JFK and 9/11 because we just haven't got the material and so on necessarily pulled together in a way that I'd be absolutely confident. But I do in a piece in Propaganda and Focus, Cock Up or Conspiracy, talk about running through really the arguments out there for this being understood as an exploited or instigated event, and especially the idea that this is not really to do with a public health crisis. This is a political stroke economic event. It's a structural deep event, essentially. So running through those examples, I mean, hopefully this is how I think it's useful for us to think about these events. And, you know, keeping these concepts, and we move to the final slide, I think do a number of things. First of all, I think that the concept of structural deep event does get us past the conspiracy label, which is a problem for us because it's something which the mainstream media use, and as many of you are familiar with, it's a term which was weaponized in the 60s, a CIA memo to close down debate on the Kennedy assassination, and the idea that you describe these people as conspiracy theorists, then people will see them as unhinged, crazy, irrational, etc. But I think sort of talking about these as structural deep events helps get past that, and it also sort of points people towards a more sort of complex understanding. You're not talking about necessarily a very clearly defined small group, you're talking about an interaction between elite groups and so on, who might sort of come together at various points and then instigate or to exploit events for various purposes, etc. But I think it's a good way of sort of defending against the conspiracy label. I also think, and this is coming from a purely kind of academic angle, it does provide us with, you know, a reasonably kind of coherent and conceptually logical framework for analysing more systematically what we see in JFK, what we see in 9/11, and what we see in COVID-19, in terms of looking at, for example, the propaganda and the role of the media, paying attention to actors who might be exploiting these events, etc. So it does provide a guiding framework, I think, for researchers. And certainly through IC 911, one of the ideas is to try to start to help people structure their thinking and researchers to structure their thinking, and even sort of, you know, potentially define clear research agendas around the concept of structural deep events, which allows us to start sort of getting people to do the empirical research necessary to really demonstrate what's going on in these cases, identifying the power networks, how they're interacting, and so on. So I think it's very useful, and I certainly found it very useful so far, and this is what I suggested to actually a number of organisations about how to think about these issues and how to build research agendas and so on. What does it tell us, and just to finish on this, what does this tell us about the world that we're living in? Again, you know, a lot of you will have already arrived at this position some time ago, but some of you perhaps not. But I think, you know, from my point of view as somebody who's, you know, existed within mainstream academia, also has a foot still in sort of mainstream academic publishing and so on, is that this concept of structural deep event does force us to, either as researchers but also as publics and so on, or whoever we are in society, to start to recognise that, okay, we've said for a long time, and people such as Noam Chomsky have said for a long time, well, the media doesn't function properly, it's co-opted by powerful actors, etc., that there is concentration of power problems in our democracies, etc. Well, what the structural deep event, especially in a way in which it gets us to connect into these kind of the shadow government, as it were, the deep state, etc., it starts to give us an understanding, when you combine that with an understanding of these propagandized events, such as JFK, 9/11, COVID-19, you basically have to recalibrate your understanding of how big a problem we've got, how much concentration of power there is. And certainly when you look at 9/11 and when you look at JFK and you accept, well, actually the evidence points very clearly towards these being instigated events, then it means that the assessments by people such as Chomsky on the state of the media are actually under-measuring the problem quite significantly. That we actually have a much more severely co-opted mainstream media than we thought we had. So I think it tells us a very important thing about the world we live in, and it brings us towards a more accurate understanding of the level of concentration of power that we have. And there is a kind of scale as you move through JFK, 9/11, and we talked about the Patriot Act, and you go through to where we are now, and if you just think of the level of censorship which is going on, and which is being rolled out across the board. A friend of mine, C.J. Hopkins, an American playwright in Berlin, he's being prosecuted by the German authorities for a couple of tweets criticising Lauterbach, the German health minister, and they're actually prosecuting him for it. It's quite extraordinary, sort of the world that we're moving through at the moment. And I think connected to that, again, the structural deep event concept, and again, linked with the understanding of these major events in our history, essentially demonstrates how hollowed out all of our institutions have become. And this is not simply our political institutions, it's also academia, it's the mainstream media, all of those elements in society which are meant to act as some kind of check on power, some kind of whistleblowing function, and so on. These are profoundly hollowed out. That JFK, the assassination of JFK wouldn't have happened, and then effectively the elite groups getting away with it for a very, very long period of time, if mainstream media or mainstream academia was anywhere close to doing the job that it's supposed to be doing in our societies. And I think the final point, certainly for me, is that this tells us something very important about the character of the elite groups who do hold sway in our societies at this point in time. And by what I mean by that is that sort of what they are capable of and what they are willing to entertain as a reasonable thing to do in order to pursue whatever it is in their ideology, whatever they think they're doing, whether they think they're protecting the Western Empire or they're protecting their own interests because they're connected to the military industrial complex, whatever, but what they're capable of doing, what their character is. I think the assassination of JFK, when we see the reality of what happened there and the reality of 9/11, we start to get a sense of where they are. Some of these people might be terribly Machiavellian in the sense of thinking these are just the tough things we need to do. We need to exert American power. We're going to have to blow up some buildings in New York in order to mobilize the support to do that. But it tells us something about the kind of the psychopathic mentality. Some of it might be Machiavellian, but there's also, I would assume, that there's an element of notions of elite superiority over populations. This is a little bit back to Plato's sort of, noble lie and the conception of society and elite groups and so on. And I think, and you certainly look at the neocons and the kind of Straussian thinking, these are people who see themselves as responsible for directing society, etc. And that's not going to be done in a democratic way, and it will have to be done through pretty terrible dark deeds and so on. So I think it does take us to that point that sort of we have a very big problem with people who are in positions of power who are willing to do very terrible things, as if starting a global war on terror wasn't terrible enough in its own right, but actually to carry out what was carried out in New York in September 11th, 2011. These are people who are not democratic, they're extremely dangerous, and they are willing to do quite remarkable things which most people have tended to give the benefit of the doubt. People like Chomsky will give the benefit of the doubt. Well, governments wouldn't do that to their own population. Well, we seem to be in that world where this is occurring, and so on. So I think that's pretty much everything I have to say. We go straight to questions.
Yeah, I think straight to questions. Michael? Do some emceeing. Do some emceeing.
Okay, so thank you so much. Questions, comments, and hopefully some answers. We have, so because we're recording this, but not recording you, we'll repeat that for your question when you say it. Or if you say it nice and clear, then we won't have to.
Thank you for the presentation. And I thought that JFK was killed because he was wanting to dissolve the Fed. So I think that the common thread that's kind of missing in the presentation is the money, and that the money is missing. And also before 9/11, there was like $1 trillion, $1 trillion missing.
Yeah.
And they were going to make a statement about it, and then
Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, I come from a kind of a war media conflict background and so on, and I'm not on the economic side, but I think, yes, those are elements. I mean, this is just a run through, but I agree absolutely. The economic components to these are very, very significant. And this is sort of one of the grey areas in a sense that we have with COVID-19, is that there is a theory out there about the repo market crisis going direct and try to shift towards central bank digital currencies. And some people argue that that's all to do with dealing with the finance market crisis and so on. And I'm completely open to, I agree, but it's not an area which I know a huge amount of, so I didn't mention it, but you're right to point
And
it
also
out.
the money laundering through Ukraine now. Right?
Yeah, I mean,
It's the same thing.
this is one of the problems with academia, is that people are siloed in academia, and this kind of people being pushed into sort of economics, politics and so on, actually sort of reduces the ability to understand these things in a holistic way, in the way that you're describing. In the same way that the division between the hard sciences and the social sciences creates problems, because as a social scientist talking about, for example, 9/11, but primarily the stuff I have been involved in with Syria and chemical weapons attacks, the criticism often is, well, you're not an expert on that, but you have to be a scientist in order to. So, but we're all silent. But of course, you can draw upon expertise where you need to, and so on. But that pulling together, I think that's been a real problem with economics, because it kind of gets ring-fenced away. And I concede the point entirely. This is an important area which we need to get a much better handle on, get straighter answers from economists, which is always a tricky thing to do. But yeah, I think those are big components, absolutely.
We'll go for Kevin and then Eilish.
Yeah, I mean, I know you made about the present time, these Straussian and the Western imperialist elite. We've got this present conflict with Russia and China, who are, to be blunt, are more than a match for them. So they're obviously frustrated. How do you see that going? Because I see that they're too powerful for the Western imperialist bloc. Well, how do you see that going? And how do you see that propaganda going?
Well, I mean, that's a very complex question. That's an easy way at it. But it's a really important one. I was talking about this with Matt before the event started today. The military-industrial complex and the Western imperial war machine is clearly in a lot of trouble at the moment. And I think it is coming up against a hard stop. And even if you think of what the neocons were planning in the 90s, and they do 9/11, they start these wars, they've achieved all of that, but now they've come up to the hard stop, which they knew they would come up against at some point. We're now in that situation. I think, Russia, we will never be able to take the territory which Russia has obtained from the Ukraine. Where does this leave the imperial war machine? China haven't got a chance in taking on China. So I think they are coming up against a hard stop, and I think it's beginning to buckle now. But at the same time, what COVID-19 tells us, there's also, I kind of awkwardly describe it as this kind of global governance elite groups who are talking about central bank digital currencies, digital ID and so on. And that's detectable across China and other powerful, and Brazil and so on. So it might well be that the Western Empire and the military-industrial complex is coming to a kind of a halt at this point in time, however slow that is. But then we have this other kind of political, economic problem with, some people talk about it in terms of the ideology of technocracy and the kind of tools that we have today because of computers and artificial intelligence and so on, and these ideas around central bank digital currency, etc. That these are tools which are incredibly tempting and seductive to countries such as China and so on. And I think it might be that we the anti-imperialists will finally win the day, and we'll see a coming to the end of American power or Western power projection militarily. But then we're going to have this wider problem with, are we going to move into an era where actually we have very, very little democracy left, there's a high degree of control over the public sphere and so on. That's my sense of what's going on at the moment. But this is all kind of informed speculation. But that's where it looks where it's going. I just can't see. I can't see Ukraine. NATO's going to lose. I just can't see any way around it. They're going to have to, draw down. And then there's China. But China is just so inconceivable that we could try to engage them militarily. I think that enough people within the elite will start to say, and you'll see more cracks and divisions emerging within the elite. So that's my kind of guesstimate at the moment.
Thank you. As a propaganda expert, what practical advice would you give when you're living in a world where people are very propagandized and don't realize they are. My particular situation is I'm currently working as a secondary school teacher, and I've already been fired from one job for putting my head above the parapet.
Right.
I'm in another job right now, and I'm trying to maybe keep it for a little bit. And I'm serious.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And I'm constantly coming across situations where the kids are being taught things that are just completely not right.
Yeah.
What advice would you give?
Well, I'm not unfamiliar with that situation for personal
Yes, that's what
reasons.
yeah.
I think in the first instance, one is sort of trying to tackle the propaganda that you know that kids are being subjected to, whether it's about 9/11 and a school book which is just rattling off what the Wikipedia page says.
BBC with other getting.
Yeah, I think, for me, I'd say you start with, as much as you can, getting students and children to think for themselves and to think critically, and that those skills, you don't have to be overcomplicated about that, but if you can just try and encourage them to, step to one side of what they see in the mainstream media, trust their own judgment, and this is the sense that I and others have had, is that, there's this term gaslighting. People's self-confidence has really gone in a lot of the population, and so they do just defer to the mainstream media. So maybe that's the safe way to go as a teacher, is to try to instill that critical, independent thinking without necessarily getting drawn into sort of raising a question about 9/11, which then gets you in trouble with the teacher kind of thing. Maybe one way is just to say, let's just start, because some students will absorb that and then will start to act upon that. So that might be the sensible or the tactically best way to approach the problem that you describe, I think.
Or you could set the Operation Northwoods as a comprehension test and see how the students get on with that.
What, in Spanish?
Some people would disagree with me and say that one should be more radical and just go out there, and I understand that. I'm not an authority on how we deal tactically with.
That's I'm kind of toying with the idea. In for a penny, in for a pound.
Well, I know for me, when I was still in a mainstream institution at Sheffield, I was thinking at some point I just can't carry it. This is right on top of my area of expertise. There's just no way I can not, and I did start to open my mouth. And quickly got into a newspaper kind of thing. But I think we are at this point where Ukraine, Russia. I mean, if that thing goes badly, we could be in a very serious situation. So maybe we are at that point where people just have to stand up and be counted. But if you don't feel that you can do that, I do think that just taking kids and just saying, just think about what you have, trust in your own judgment. When we look at the towers coming down. And just think for yourself, how is that, etc., etc. And that might be a way of navigating.
I've got a lady at the back, and then the gentleman here, and then Matt. I'll repeat your question for the recording.
COVID-19.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of a series of questions, so it might be a bit, I don't know, how you want to put it. I guess I'm struggling to kind of see it as being necessarily in the same category as something like JFK 9/11, in terms of whether it was an instigated event, because whilst the other two are sort of discrete events in time that you can see could have been done in sort of secretly, what are we really saying about COVID? Are we saying that if we're saying it was instigated in the sense that it wasn't really a deadly pathogen, then it seems to me like there's a lot of information that would have to be falsified or distorted across so many countries. So that's one question, is like,
Sure.
why do you see them in the same category in that sense? And the second question is about the I guess maybe it's just asking to clarify what you mean about lockdown policies. Like, again, I sort of can't help but think if we accept the premise that COVID-19 was a real pathogen, however it was started, however it was released, and it was actually deadly, then wouldn't, are we saying that the entire sort of public health community of the world kind of was incorrect in thinking that social distancing was
No, let's all be friends.
I'll answer, yeah. I'll answer.
Already saying what everyone was thinking.
Yeah, okay, no, I'll answer. I'm wary of time as well. Yeah. On the one hand, I mean, as I said at the end, you know, sort of sorry, go on.
If it seems very obvious to other people.
No.
To me, it's not particularly obvious to me. That's why I'm not.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is that I was kind of like, no, I was saying the level of uncertainty is unclear. I think it's definitely being exploited. Yeah. The instigated thing. I'm sort of publicly keeping, as I'm on camera, I'm keeping an open mind on it. However, okay, so I'm involved in Panda, this organisation, which is a COVID pushback organisation based in South Africa. And, you know, I've seen enough material from some of the scientists involved in that to see that, for example, excess mortality kicks off only at the point of lockdown across multiple countries and so on. So what it's starting to look like in terms of it being a dangerous pathogen is that a significant number of deaths, some people argue all of them, but some say that a significant number was actually because of the way the virus, because of the lockdowns which disrupted the healthcare, putting people onto ventilators and so on. And there does seem to be quite a lot of kind of evidence supporting that this thing was not novel, particularly novel, and not particularly dangerous. It might have been a real virus circulating. There are, of course, some people who argue that it wasn't there at all. But there is, I think that needs to be factored in terms of understanding the response. And, you know, organisations, health services, etc., and governments, you know, if you call a pandemic and you cry fire, you're going to create this kind of a panic and so on. And that does seem to have happened to an extent. So that could be, that's evidence in part for instigation. And there are other people who argue that, you know, they say, well, look at Event 201. They were gaming this in October. This was the World Health Organization and Bill Gates. They were gaming. They were, you know, planning for, and this was a public event, for a new coronavirus and what we should do. And that was in October of 2019. There are other people who point to the economic component, the repo market crisis, going direct for that. And, you know, the argument there is that actually the lockdowns were to do with managing some of the economic fallout of going direct and so on. So these are kind of arguments out there, but my position is that, you know, these are all possibilities in my mind. So there's a lot of information to sort of decide what you think is authoritative and what is not. But there is a case, there's clearly a case to be made, and some people are making those arguments, and certainly kind of Panda's position is that this virus, if it was real, as it were, but it wasn't particularly new. It was a variation of corona, and it wasn't, the key thing is it wasn't particularly dangerous. And I mean, I've seen enough of the stats to see that that's what it looks like. It looks like the excess mortality is occurring when they're locking down and when they're implementing. The other thing that Denny Rancourt always points out is that they weren't prescribing antibiotics and so on. So you had a lot of people who would have been treatable with an antibiotic, but they developed pneumonia and died and so on. So this is the kind of thing which a lot of the kind of scientists are sort of arguing over and so on. So I think all I say is that you could be right, and that this is just an event which has just been exploited, but there are people who would argue that there's actually quite a lot of indicators of it being instigated through those mechanisms. And then you get into, was it something which was leaked out of a lab? Was it just a pre-existing virus which they then capitalized upon through the PCR tests, etc., rebranding flu, and so on? And these are the arguments going on in the kind of COVID dissident science community and so on, which I don't have authority to comment on. So I don't know for sure, but there are those arguments out there. So I think, you know, I'm confident in saying this has clearly been exploited by various actors. The instigated one, I'll leave until people better than I have come up with some authoritative analyses of, you know, the virus and so on.
I'm afraid we only have 5 minutes
sorry.
more, and this gentleman was first.
Okay, well, I too was a secondary school teacher, and what I was saying about the way the children are being educated, I've learned just this week that for GCSE maths, you can now bring in a calculator. Students don't need to add up or take any responsibility or exercise any
Yeah.
judgment of abstraction in what they're doing. So, and there's a huge pass rate, and you have to get 26% to get a C grade, which is lamentable for people in our, brought up in our environment. But the point I wanted to make with that was that too much is invested in the abstract authority of somebody telling you that this means this, that means that, this technology will provide you with that answer. What I think JF Kennedy was very much in touch with was the idea of limitation. To be human beings, we have to limit our ambitions and respect our limitations and those of others, and the dignity that is retained through doing that. Because if we see other people merely as obstructions to our fancied improvement and self-perfection, then we're paving the road to war.
Yeah.
So what we need to be doing is educating our children to be creative, to take intellectual responsibility for how they communicate, and the value, to be able to assess the value of what they're actually learning.
Yeah.
And that has been taken away from them all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
I
two
agree.
two quick last questions. One from Mark and then from Steve.
Yeah, I just in response to this question,
Yeah.
I just handed you there.
Yeah.
Is if you just read out the title, it's a document that says all doctors and nurses who have to deal with patients and how they manage explaining to them how do you deal with a conspiracy theorist who says that the vaccines are fake and whatever. And that's what, and it's confirmed by one of my friends who works in the NHS.
Optimizing vaccination rollout, do's and don'ts for all messaging, documents and communications in the widest sense.
Yeah, if you go through it, depending on what your title is, what whether you're a consultant or a doctor or a GP, it will say how do you deal with, how do you explain when somebody says, well, this is all conspiracy theory, and then it tells you how to basically tell them what bullshit is.
Well, thanks for this. It's very interesting.
Okay, last question, I'm afraid for now. We will have a chance to mingle later, so we could pursue some of these incredibly interesting lines of inquiry. Steve?
With the COVID, all nations went with it, except Sweden. So why do you think that was?
Well, I think in terms of, this is a very good question. If we think of 9/11 as growing out of the military-industrial complex driving this, the Western Empire and so on, with COVID-19, this is why I think introducing the notion of the global governance, elite structures and so on, which are operating on a global level, starts to explain some of what you've just said. If you look at the World Health Organization, for example, you have, we know who funds it and so on, and we know where it is politically and ideologically and so on. These have considerable reach. So in a way, sometimes I think about it in terms of, is this an outgrowth of the Western Empire military-industrial complex into the institutions of global governance, where they have been able to, as it were, enact this event, which has created sufficient panic and alarm to get other countries on board? The other argument out there is that, Chinese government was part of this psyop, as it were, and that you've got powerful countries such as China who are salivating at the kind of technologies of control and how they can control the population with those kind of fear mechanisms and so on. So there might be even sort of agreement at various points between China and the West. I don't know, but certainly I think the global governance structures are quite real, and we can see them. And we can see how the United Nations is, they're on board with the censorship, disinformation agenda as well, and so on. So I think what it tells us is that we're dealing with elite groups who are operating globally.
But everyone else went with it, all the nations. You're thinking, if they've got their fingers in every other nation, why not Sweden?
Well, I can't say for sure. I don't have an answer. It might be that some countries, managed to step off. Other people have argued that Sweden is always well down the road on vaccination and so on. So I just don't have the expertise on Sweden itself, but it could just be an aberration and so on.
They also have a system where the chief doctor, epidemiologist, makes that decision, not the politician. So that's basically his call, and he wasn't going to go along with the who.
But many of them already chipped. Many of them chipped.
Well, that's the thing. A lot of people said that they were further down the road of these kind of control
And it was a Swedish school that I was fired from, so.
There are also constitutional constraints on what Sweden could do to the population, whereas there weren't so much here.
Like Japan.
Okay, so we've got to thank Dr. Piers Robinson for that.